In looking at the issue of ranking these strategic options, we have not considered a very important issue, and that is the issue of social costs. You know, in the three strategic options that we ranked in the earlier slide, there were three key result areas, one relating to profits, another relating to supplier dependence, and the third relating to competitiveness. But there was no key result area relating to pollution, for instance, right, or possible pollution. There was no KRA on that. So we have not considered social costs, and this is one factor which is increasingly becoming critical and crucial when it comes to strategic options. What is really happening is that governments and organizations, funding organizations, are becoming very, very concerned about this issue. The public is becoming very concerned about this issue. Customers are becoming very concerned about this issue. And that is why it's very important to build in social costs into the evaluation, into the ranking matrix. For instance, many years ago, when the disaster took place at Bhopal, the shares of Union Carbide quoted in the US took a 30% dip because of the incident in Bhopal. Now, if you consider that from a financial standpoint, the Indian operations probably accounted for less than 1% of the operations of Union Carbide, but the gravity of the offense by the company was perceived by the shareholders in the US to be so large, right, was perceived to be so enormous that share values in the US actually fell by 30%, right? Now this is an indicator of the kind of importance that the public attaches to social costs, right? How do we incorporate social costs into analysis, into evaluating a strategic option? What we really need to do is use this technique called cost-benefit analysis. This is a technique which has been popularized by several UN organizations. It's a very elaborate technique, and this is the technique that needs to be used. It's important to use this technique when we are looking at government approvals, and therefore in the case of public sector units, PSU companies, it's very, very important that cost-benefit analysis is done for their strategic options. Right. We now come to the issue of risk. Risk is perhaps one of the most critical issues in strategic option evaluation, right? Because different strategic options are exposed to risks to different extents. Now, what kind of risks are we talking about? We are talking about earthquakes, floods, natural calamities like that. We are talking about economic risks, economic risks relating to growth of the economy, inflation in the economy, interest rates in the economy. Then we are looking at financial risk. Now, what is financial risk? Financial risk is a very well-defined term. When we talk about financial risk, we are talking about the debt coverage ratio, meaning what is the ability of that particular strategic option to repay the debts that the company would need to take to put that operation into action, right? We choose a particular strategic option, and that will give us certain revenue, and it will give us certain EBIT, right? Certain earnings before interest and tax. Now, with those EBIT earnings before interest and tax, to what extent are we able to cover the interest on the debt, and to what extent would sufficient funds be left over to repay the debt as agreed in the original debt repayment schedule? This is the question of financial risk. Then we have the question of business risk, where we are looking at things like entry barriers. Now, if entry barriers are high, if it's difficult for competitors to enter your industry, it's a good thing from the point of view of business risk, because then your business risk is low. On the other hand, if it's easy for competitors to enter your industry, if entry barriers are low, then business risk to your company increases. The extent of increase in business risk varies from one strategic option to another. That is the point, right? Therefore, we need to look at the issue of risk when we are evaluating strategic options. Let's look at supplier power, for instance. Now, supplier power, if we are getting into a particular situation because of that strategic option, if we are getting into a situation where the number of suppliers that the company has reduces, narrows down, right, then what is going to happen? Supplier risk power is going to increase, and hence the business risk will also increase. Okay? Right. And then there is political risk. For instance, there is the risk of nationalization, right? Now, if, for instance, one of the strategic options that Indian Oil Corporation, IOC, is considering is investment in Russia, is investment of $1 billion in Russia in developing a particular oil field, right? That's one strategic option that Indian Oil Corporation is considering. Now, the political risk of this option is quite high, because the Russian state has had a history of taking over oil and gas companies, right? Therefore, it is entirely possible that the IOC could, in the near future, stand to lose this $1 billion, or a significant part of this $1 billion that it has invested in Russia. So that's the political risk element, right? So these are the kinds of risks that we are talking about when it comes to strategic option evaluation.